Hello and welcome to The Top Story, the podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Xizhi. Coming up in this edition, Hamas has reached an agreement for a ceasefire and prisoner exchange is possible if Israel stops setting new conditions. The United Nations official says challenges in Syria require support that goes beyond humanitarian aid. And Moscow has vowed revenge against Ukraine for the killing of Russian Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov after Kyiv claimed responsibility. We begin in the Middle East. As negotiations on a ceasefire in Gaza have gained momentum in recent weeks, Hamas now says reaching an agreement for a truce and prisoner exchange is possible if Israel stops setting new conditions. It describes the discussions on a ceasefire in Doha under the auspices of the Qatari and Egyptian mediators as serious and positive. Media reports say Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was in Cairo for a ceasefire for hostage deal, but his spokesperson has denied the reports. Egypt and Qatar, with the participation of the United States, are trying to mediate an agreement to end the ongoing conflict in Gaza, which has lasted for 14 months. Jonathan Regev reports from Tel Aviv.
Israel is hoping to create a reality in the Gaza Strip which will be quite similar to the one seen in the West Bank, meaning that the daily life will be controlled by the Palestinians. Israel will not be in charge of education, sewage, garbage, you name it, but will have an overall structure of security. How so? Israeli forces will be allowed or will be able to go into the Gaza Strip if needed based on intelligence. We're seeing this practically night after night in the West Bank. We're hearing about nightly raids in places like Jenin, Nablus, and other places in the West Bank. So, according to Israel Katz, the reality in the Gaza Strip will look pretty much the same. Israeli forces will go in based on intelligence to carry out anti-terrorism raids. This is according to Israel Katz. This is according to his plan, carry out operations against militants in the Gaza Strip. And it will be, if it happens, it will be, of course, a major change from everything that we've seen in the Gaza Strip since Israeli disengagement since 2005. Practically in the 18 years between 2005 and 2023, no Israeli forces were in the Gaza Strip, at least not publicly. The plan, according to Israel Katz, will be different. Once the war is over, Israeli forces will act inside the Gaza Strip based on intelligence, practically, we can assume, night after night, as they do in the West Bank.
That was Jonathan Regev on attempts to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza. Now with the latest from Syria. A ceasefire between Turkey and the Kurdish Syrian forces around the northern Syrian city of Manbij is now valid until the end of the week. Washington brokered an initial ceasefire last week after fighting in Syria escalated this month as rebel groups entered Damascus and overthrew President Bashar al-Assad. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says his forces will stay in a buffer zone on the Syrian border amid internal conflicts. He made the comments at Mount Hermon, located about 10 kilometers from the border with the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. It is the first time that a sitting Israeli leader has entered that far into Syria. Mass graves have been discovered around Damascus and other parts of Syria. More details from Philip Crowther with the Associated Press.
More and more headlines similar to that one over the next few days and weeks. A lot of these mass graves that are now being discovered and are being examined around Damascus, but also in other parts of Syria. They were certainly not accessible to international investigators who are now slowly but surely making their way here to Syria. The number of 100,000 dead bodies or parts thereof that might be found in just one mass grave to the north of the capital, Damascus, it does not sound like an exaggeration. So a lot of these graves, they have now been discovered. It's known where they are, but they have not been unearthed yet, so we don't know what exactly the number of dead bodies is going to be that will be discovered there. But I think you can expect a lot of grim discoveries over the next few days and weeks as the extent of that system, it appears to have been, really become known.
That's AP correspondent Philip Crowther. A United Nations official says challenges in Syria require support that goes beyond humanitarian aid. The UN Special Envoy to Syria says inclusive foundations are needed to rebuild the country. He made remarks at the Security Council public meeting on Syria. Jody Jacobs reports from New York.
Speaking from Damascus, where he met with the new caretaker government, Geir Pedersen told UN Security Council members that Syria now faces a whole new reality and that the challenges are many.
Of course, it is only 11 days since the fall of the former regime. My door is open, and I hope in the coming days we can build that dialogue. I understand, we all do, the massive challenges facing the authorities and the need to help concretely. No. We understand the need for stability, but stability will not last long if not built on credible and inclusive foundations. The time is to build those foundations now.
Pedersen added that the needs in Syria go far beyond humanitarian aid and has called on the international community to help Syria rebuild its economy. Addressing the Council, the chair of the Syrian Negotiations Commission stressed the importance of dialogue in Damascus. He highlighted the need for an inclusive national conference to reflect the aspirations of all Syrian people. Council members reiterated their support for Syria's transition, many also warning Israel to respect Syria's territorial sovereignty and withdraw from the UN buffer zone along the border. According to the UN, Syria is one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world, with some 17 million people, or more than 70% of the population, in need of assistance. It says while the attention might now be on a political transition, which is key, the world should not forget the millions in need.
That was Jody Jacobs in New York. Turning to Europe, Ukraine has claimed responsibility for killing the head of the Russian Armed Forces Radiological, Chemical and Biological Defense Troops. Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov and his assistant died in an explosion outside a residential building in Moscow. A bomb planted on a scooter blew up, killing the two men and causing extensive damage. Moscow is holding Ukraine responsible for a series of high-profile assassinations on its soil. Alex Kadia sent this report from Kyiv.
The intelligence service, the SBU, telling media outlets that it was behind this hit. That's about as official a confirmation as you're going to get for such a sensitive operation. What we do know is just a day before this hit on Lieutenant General Kirillov, he was accused by Ukrainian prosecutors in absentia, of course, of committing war crimes by ordering his troops to use banned chemical substance, chloropicrin, against Ukrainian forces on the front line. He's also been accused of that by the United States and the United Kingdom, the UK Foreign Office saying that those troops were ordered to use chloropicrin, which is banned by the Chemical Weapons Convention, which Russia has signed. General Kirillov accused of ordering the use of those chemical weapons by Ukraine just a day ago. So certainly, although an official government spokesperson hasn't come out publicly and said that Ukraine is behind this, the intelligence services has, and the prosecutors have accused him of war crimes. He had also been sanctioned by the United Kingdom for spreading disinformation about biolabs in Ukraine. He had accused the United States of starting the COVID-19 pandemic to target Russia. So certainly he was a high-profile target. Certainly this has been a very high-profile assassination claimed by the intelligence services here in Ukraine. He was in charge, of course, of Russia's radiological, chemical and biological defense forces. And even though Russia says they had no chemical weapons since 2017, he and they have been accused of using them on the battlefield in the last couple of months. So certainly a very high-profile hit for the Ukrainians. The other thing to think is about what that retaliation might look like. So here in Kyiv, top Ukrainian officials will be under very, very tight security. We can probably imagine there will be tight security across the city and across the country.
That was Alex Kadia in Ukraine. Moscow has vowed revenge against Ukraine for the killing of Lieutenant General Kirillov. Authorities have arrested 2 suspects as they investigate the case. The death is likely to prompt Russian authorities to review the security protocols for the army's top officials. From Moscow, here's Dasha Chernyshova.
Now, what we have heard from the Russian officials was that there could be a response by the Russian side to anyone who has carried out this attack. The officials here in Russia have been saying that retribution is needed, and some have even alleged that Kyiv is undoubtedly behind this assassination. Dmitry Medvedev, Russia's former president, has said very clearly that there will be an imminent retaliation from the Russian side. He also has said that this assassination was proving that Kyiv was, in his words, in agony and realized denies the inevitability of a military defeat. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova has also been commenting on this situation and the assassination, saying that Kyiv has been for years uncovering and systemically exposing the crimes of the Anglo-Saxons. That's her interpretation, given the very fact that Kyiv has grown to eminence in Russia since the start of the so-called special military operation in Ukraine, because he was regularly giving briefings about the alleged attempts by the West and Kyiv to create the network of biolabs to perpetrate chemical and biological attacks on Russia. And therefore, officials here in Russia insist that some of the evidence and what Kyiv was actually bringing to the public was threatening someone, and that's why they have decided to assassinate him. So one way or another, the investigation is ongoing. We understand that the investigators are now looking into different versions of what has happened, but the main evidence, as we understand, as things stand now, is the scooter, the rental scooter that was outside the apartment building, where apparently the explosive device was actually planted, the equivalent to 200 grams of highly explosive TNT. So certainly the investigation is ongoing, and the hope in Moscow is that this will not be repeated, because among the ordinary Russians there are many questions as to how security is being provided to its top officials.
That was Stasha Chinisheva reporting from Moscow. Finally, in Asia, South Korean authorities have made a new attempt to search the presidential office for evidence in their investigation into President Yoon Suk-yeol's short-lived declaration of martial law. A legal counsel for Yoon says he plans to fight accusations of insurrection in court. The fate of the impeached president is now in the hands of the country's courts, and the country remains divided politically. Shane Ham spoke to several experts to find out more.
South Korea is in the midst of a political crisis following the impeachment of President Yoon Suk-yeol. As the nation anxiously awaits a decision from the Constitutional Court on whether the impeachment will stand, the political atmosphere remains chaotic and confrontational.
그렇다면 본인들의 탄핵 트라우마만 생각할 것이 아니라
Politicians shouldn't just think about their own trauma during impeachment, but should first consider the public's trauma when under martial law. That's what I believe should be the attitude of a proper political party and politician.
The Constitutional Court has up to 180 days to deliberate President Yoon's impeachment. If upheld, a presidential election must be held within 60 days. That's why the court's decision will not only dictate the president's future, but will likely shape the nation's political landscape for years to come.
Even if the Constitutional Court conducts a legal trial focused on violations of the Constitution and laws, it is difficult to completely disregard the political climate, public opinion, or the judgment of the majority of citizens.
If snap elections were to be held, experts say Democratic Party leader Lee Jae-myung is a frontrunner to represent the opposition. The ruling People Power Party, meanwhile, faces an uphill battle to unify following the resignation of its leadership.
85 members of the People Power Party voted against impeachment. I think addressing this is extremely important because, simply put, they are so out of touch with public opinion. Based on recent polls, the actions of the People Power Party lawmakers represent the interests of only 12% of the entire population.
And as the nation holds its breath, South Koreans are left grappling with fundamental questions about democracy, accountability, and the future of their political leadership following the shock of martial law.
That was Shane Ham reporting from Seoul. Now, recapping the headlines before we go, Hamas has reached an agreement for a ceasefire and a prisoner exchange is possible if Israel stops setting new conditions. A United Nations official says challenges in Syria require support that goes beyond humanitarian aid. And Moscow has vowed revenge against Ukraine for the killing of Russian Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov after Kyiv claimed responsibility. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to The Beijing Hour, a one-hour podcast news magazine program. We would welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Qizhi. Thanks for listening.